Would be.
All right, okay. Go ahead, Eric. So anyway, the sheet that I've passed around for everybody, double check and make sure you're on the list if you submitted your predictions in time. Hopefully I got everybody. I went through the email yesterday and I think I got everybody. But if I didn't, please let me know. The range for Astro wins predictions ranged from 98 down to 81. So nobody predicted a losing season. Optimism, baby. But of course, Larry Dierker is the most pessimistic one. He predicted 81. The average was 88. So it's everybody's pretty much in the same range. For Jose Altuve playing left field, the average was 80. It looks like the most somebody predicted was 135 games, and some down as low as in the 20s. So it's quite a range for the predicting it. Altuve playing left. For Yordan Alvarez playing left, the average was 40, and most people, I think the highest was 99, and the lowest was in the like 15. I mean, so anyway, please take a look. I'll pass this one around as well. And if there's any changes needed, please let me know. Okay. Thanks, Eric.
All right, so without further ado, we all know why we're here to see Tal. We all know that the 60th anniversary of the Astrodome was just a couple of days ago of the official opening of the Astrodome. But today, I think, Tal, you could probably remind everybody, maybe a little back. Today is the anniversary of the first regular season game in the Astrodome. The Astros versus the Phillies, which unfortunately the Astros lost 2-0. But anyway, so
we've got glare today too.
What's that?
We've got glare today. The sun's too bright.
That's right. So without further ado, Tal Smith, it's always an honor to talk to you. Tal he's been a member of the chapter for as long as I can remember, longer than I have, obviously. Gave book donations to the chapter. He's done a lot for this chapter. So, ladies and gentlemen, Tal Smith.
Okay, thanks. Before I start, I can get along with what's your time schedule? What else you have to accomplish? I know you've got dinner. What time would you like to eat?
I don't know. First 5-10 minutes. First pitch.
I'm gonna turn this around and use it as a podium as an extra business. So anyway, anyway, happy to be here. Happy to see everybody. As Joe made reference to, Wednesday was the 60th anniversary from the first event in the Dome, and the following day, Thursday, was Judge Hopkins' birthday. And I was dismayed to see that there was virtually no reference in the Houston Chronicle or any of the news media that I saw. But that, to me, doesn't detract from the significance of the event. How many of you here had an opportunity to be to see an event in the Astrodome in its first year, 1965? It's pretty good. How many had a chance to see an event years after that? Okay, so almost everybody here has experienced the Dome. Great. To me, it was one of the most significant events in my lifetime, and I think it holds that same standing worldwide. It was truly the eighth wonder of the world. It was just magnificent. As those of you that saw it and had an opportunity to experience it, as you realize, I had the quantity.
They're already.
I had the good fortune to experience the birth of the Dome and its early years. I lived with it day in and day out for about 2.5 years, and in the years after that, got to experience all the wonder and the joy that it provided from the various events. To me, it was a wonderful opportunity, something I'll never forget. I had. Since I was uncertain as to what the role would be, but I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm sometimes asked by those that know me soon recognize that I don't hold a PhD from MIT. So, and they asked how I got involved. So I'm going to take a few minutes, and I hope it's not too long, to give you a little bit of background. I'd wanted to be stands in baseball from the time I was 7 years old. I'll cut that story short. I was fortunate after college, after a couple of years in the Air Force, and knocking on doors, I got an opportunity to join the Cincinnati Reds in November 1957. Baseball operations were a lot smaller in those days. When I was with the Reds, I counted up the other day to make sure I was right. We had 11 full-time employees, including the switchboard operator. Now, I'm talking about office employees. We did have scouts and minor league managers and so on and so forth. But in the actual Reds office, there were 11 people. And the Reds office downtown, they played their games at Crosley Field. That was a couple of miles away. The ticket office, we had a permanent ticket office on Vine Street. There were 3 full-time year-round ticket employees. So if you include them, we had a total of 14 people. But that was a great opportunity to learn the business. I started as what was called an administrative assistant in the farm department. As most of you know, the farm department really in those days encompassed scouting and minor league operations. And it was a great experience for me. So my direct boss, the farm director at that time, was Bill McKechnie Jr. He was the son of the Hall of Fame manager, Deacon Bill McKechnie. So anyway, I started in late 1957. An awful lot to learn, and I did at that time. We moved to Cincinnati. Obviously, we were expecting our first child. Valerie was born in March. I waited until after Christmas of 1957 to tell Johnny that I was going to have to go to spring training in Laredo, Texas, where the minor league spring training was. And as I recall, we got there. It stands on President's Day. I drove with Bill McKechnie Jr., the farm director, and our local scout, Buzz Boyle. And so we drove. And that was my first look at Houston, because from Cincinnati to Laredo, we came right through Houston. I dozed off and on and went up, and I remember seeing the Shamrock Hotel. So it was my first exposure to Houston. I went on to Laredo. And by the time I got back to Cincinnati, our daughter was like 6 weeks old. In those days, operations were a whole lot different. You didn't have anything like family leave or so on. And it was just expected you had a job and you would fulfill it. And I wasn't the only one. Dave Bristol, who later went on to manage the Reds and the Brewers and the Braves and the Giants. Dave was a rookie manager for us at that time, managed Geneva in the New York, Pennsylvania League. Dave and I are about the same age, and his wife was expecting their first child about the same time, I think a week after Valerie was born. I don't think Dave got to see his wife and firstborn until much later than I did. Anyway, that was just a circumstance. As I mentioned, we went to Laredo, and I mentioned I was as administrative assistant. At that time, the Reds had 11 minor league clubs, several hundred players. It was a big operation, and you didn't have the technology you have today. And our office staff consisted of Bill McKechnie and myself. And during spring training, Bill became ill and had to resign. And Gabe Paul, the general manager of the club, flew down to Laredo. And here I'd been there for like 3 months. I had like 3 months experience by that time. And he appointed Phil Seggy as the farm director. And Phil's a great guy. He'd been a minor league player, minor league manager, and at that time was a scout for the Reds and so on. And that was fine. But Phil had absolutely no background from the standpoint of the administrative operation of a ball club. And it was much more complex in those days. When I first joined the Reds and I found out or had an idea as to what was going to be involved, I took upon myself to fast track, to cram as much as I could. At those times, the rules in baseball were compiled on what was called the Blue Book, and that had the major league agreement It had the professional baseball agreement, which governed the operation between major league and minor league clubs. And then it had all the rules that affected minor league clubs. A big, thick document about waivers and options and recalls and all these kind of things. And it was a lot more complex than it is today. Fortunately, it's been simplified. But I can recall when we first moved to Cincinnati, we had an apartment in Swipton Village, and I'd take the bus into the Reds offices, and I had time on stands on the bus, and I just made a point to stand read the blue book. And fortunately, I did. So that by the time that McKechnie became ill and Seggy came on, and well, now we had to sink or swim, and fortunately, I had learned enough, and we were able to get by. Anyway. Since I had pretty good exposure because of the small number of people in the office, and you learn basically what everybody else's job was. And then the general manager was Gabe Paul, and I certainly had exposure to Gabe. Would have meetings and not be present. I was, as the rookie and the youngest one, and lowest standing. I kept quiet, but for the most part. But anyway, so by the third year, by 1960. Things were going well, and Gabe was pleased. I think he actually asked me at one time. The treasurer of the Reds, the financial officer, was aging, Bill Bramham, and it was obvious that he was going to have to step aside, and Gabe asked if I would be interested, and I thanked him for the consideration, but I told him if I wanted to be a CPA or something, I didn't have to get in baseball to do that, so I turned that down. But anyway, as I said, I'm getting a little bit long-winded here, but by the summer of 1960, the third year, so the Reds were on the road. And since I was home with Johnny and Valerie for dinner, and a phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Gabe. And this is the first time he had ever called me. He was on the road at a meeting. I was aware of that, and he asked me how things were going, so I filled him in as best I could, and anything I thought might be of interest to him. And so we concluded the call, and I turned to John. I said, that was the strangest call. There was no reason for that whatsoever. I subsequently found out the day of that call was the day that the National League had met and first took up the question of expanding. And I guess Gabe subconsciously wanted to share this, but not tell anybody. I mean, and as it turned out, he later invited me to join him in Houston, as I'll get into. But anyway, I thought that was strange. A couple of days after that, just as I was getting ready to leave for the ballpark, as I said, the Reds office downtown, played our games at Crosley Field. Part of my responsibility in those days, and this is prior to the amateur draft and so on. So there was a lot of competition for signing players, and the bonuses weren't very large to begin with. And I signed a lot of players, a lot more high school players in those days. And part of my responsibility was at Crosley Field to coordinate the workouts for the local high school kids that our scouts brought in. As time went on, that included the likes of Pete Rose and so on. And so anyway, I was getting ready to leave for the ballpark, and I got someone back to Gabe's office at an unusual time because he knew the routine. But anyway, he had two gentlemen in his office he wanted to introduce me to. It turned out to be George Kirksey and Craig Cullen. As most of you know, they were the original founders, so to speak, of the Houston franchise that was going to hold a franchise in the Continental League. I was aware of the Continental League. There's been a lot of publicity about it. That was a Branch Rickey concept and so on. And I think it was used primarily as a stepping stone to expansion. But anyway, Gabe introduced me to Cullen and Kirksey and asked me to spend some time with them the following day, and I did. They came in, and George had he was just full of questions, as Wayne can appreciate. And so that was sort of the second step in this it stands in this puzzle. And hey, Bob, come on in. I'll hold off for a second.
We're on the drive, so.
Hi, Maggie.
Hey, thanks.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Please.
Just,
Right here, Bob.
Okay.
well, I can go on the back road.
There's
There's no more chair.
Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm not here, John. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I like it paid extra, right? But you had it. Take a look. Oh, thank you. Peggy, I'm reciting what led me to Houston and to ultimately to being able to work on the Astrodome project. And right now I'm into my third year in Cincinnati in 1960. I've had this unusual call from Gabe Paul, who never had occasion to call me. He was at a National League meeting and he called me at home that night. And I turned to my wife and said, I don't understand why you called. There's no purpose for it. So forth. What turned out when I look back on it, that was the day the National League first took up and considered expansion on a confidential basis. So I guess that's what drove Gabe to call me. And a couple of days after that, he introduced me to Kirksey and Cullinan, who were franchise holders for the Continental League, and asked me to spend some time with them. So as I was pointing out to the group, the puzzle's starting to come together. I've got these two things, but then there was a third one. And it had been a busy summer. Phil Segi, as I said, my boss, he was a great guy. We got along well. But Phil became ill during the summer, was hospitalized for quite a period of time. And in those situations, you don't have anybody to bring in. You just get the work done. So you put in extra hours and so on and so on. We got through all of that, and everything was fine with no mishaps. And I mentioned to Phil in early October. I said, as soon as we filed a reserve list, and that was a big deal, how you protected your contracts and so on, without going into the detail, but it was a big important process. And the filing date for that was October 16th. And I told Phil, I said, as soon as I get the reserve list done, he said, Johnny and I are going to take Valerie to see the grandparents. We're going to drive to Durham. And that was fine with Phil. And Phil usually had paid, and he came back after lunch one day and he said, I mentioned to Gabe that you're leaving on vacation. And Gabe says, does he have to leave then? I said, Phil, for crying out loud. I haven't had a vacation in 2 or 3 years. We've done this, we've done that. I was a little bit hacked by it. And anyway, they didn't stand on my way. So we made plans. And after the filing the reserve list, we got in the car and drove to Cincinnati. In those days, I had a Chevy that I bought when I went into service. It didn't have a radio. I didn't pay for the extras. It did not have a car radio. So we drove 500 miles from Cincinnati to Durham, pull up in my parents' driveway. My mother comes out to meet us, gives us a hug and said, you've had all kinds of phone calls. Gabe has called a couple of times. Segi has called and mentioned a couple of other people on the staff that had called. And I had no idea what was going on. So I go in and I forget who I called first, but anyway, I eventually talked to Gabe, and he sprung the news that he was going that he was taking a job at Houston, the expansion club, and asked me to go along. Well, that was a great opportunity. I quickly, said yes. Considered that, so we turned around the next day or the day after and drove back to Cincinnati and packed up and headed for Houston. And, so I can still recall when I first got to Houston, we stayed in some motel the first night or so, and one up then was asked to come to the Branch Street office. That's where Judge Hoffein's, that was his headquarters. And so went to Branch Street, and boy, lo and behold, go downstairs and meet the judge. And Gabe was there, and then several others. And the first time I'd seen the model of the Astros. And the judge, after greeting us and so on and so, went into his presentation, and he was so good at explaining the vision for the Astrodome and what it's going to be and all this and that. So that was great. That was my first exposure. And obviously, as time went on, you heard a lot more about it. Yes.
Was it that easy of a decision? I mean, the Reds went to the World Series, and
the Reds went to the World Series next year. I don't have very good timing. I left the Reds after 1960. After they won the National League pennant in 61. I left the Yankees in 75 to come here. The Yankees won the pennant in 76. But No, I mean, seriously, from the standpoint of expansion and opportunity, and I forget the money aspect, that wasn't particularly stands important, but the fact that, that Gabe, who was general manager and well recognized and well thought of and whatnot, I didn't have to give it much thought. There wasn't any question in my mind. Obviously in those days you got relocation and so on, but you're younger and you can, all those things are a lot easier. So anyway, we got here and it was exciting, a little bit chaotic as time went on, but we started putting together a staff and so on. And Gabe would ask me to lunch almost every day, and then it got to a point where he was using me as a sounding board or a confidant or something, which was fine, despite the age difference. I understood that and appreciated it, and whatnot. Then he would start sharing his concerns, and it was obvious that he and Judge Hoffein's chemistry wasn't real good. There was somewhat of a collision course, and that was understandable because at Cincinnati, Gabe had complete autonomy. The owner was Powell Crosley. Powell Crosley was retired. He lived off the coast of South Carolina at St. Bull Island. We would see Mr. Crosley twice a year. He would come up once for a Saturday game during the summer because he had a pet project that he was interested in that would be promoted that day. And the other time we would see him would be at the Christmas luncheon, which was a very staid and sober affair at the hotel. And those are the only two times we saw him. And the rest of the time, Gabe ran the club. I mean, he had as much power as an owner. I'm sure there were probably things that came up that he maybe had to clear, but there certainly wasn't any interference. Mr. Crosley wasn't seeking publicity. He didn't appear to have an ego and so on. Now, obviously, it was, and those were the circumstances that Gabe had operated under for years. And he got here and we'd have these lunches and he'd start expressing concern about the judge and how flamboyant he was. And Gabe was not flamboyant. He was the exact opposite. And so Gabe, I can recall one lunch, Gabe pulled a document out of his coat pocket, and it was an extract from his contract. And he said, "Here, Tal, read this." And it was a particular paragraph that described Gabe's authority. And it was almost as if Gabe had written it. I mean, there wasn't any doubt about his complete autonomy, no interference, and so on and so forth. I don't know whether Hoffman read it at the time. And the issue was that Gabe, when he made the decision to come to Houston, his first encounters were with Cullen and Kirksey. And a lot of people thought that they were actually running the club. And turned out you get here and you find out Hoffman and Ari Bob Smith. And at that time, Ari Bob Smith wasn't that involved from a standpoint of any decisions. It was a judge that had the profile, and a lot of it because of the Astrodome concept and his vision, but also his personality. And Gabe asked me to read the contract, and how do you interpret it? And I told him, and whatnot. So it was quite clear things weren't going well, and But that was that was during the winter months of our first year here, and part of the deal was when Houston got the franchise, the local club, the Buffs, were locally owned by a group which included Marty Marion, the former Cardinal shortstop, Marty Marion, and I believe it was Harry Hopkins. I may be wrong in the first name; his last name was Hopkins. And one of they owned the Buffs, and we had to buy the club so that we had exclusive right to the territory. And so as a result of that, we operated the Buffs as it stands in 1961. The Buffs had a working agreement with the Cubs. They provided the players, but we had the operation, selling the tickets and all that kind of stuff. And so as a result of that, many of us who had been at Brand Street moved our offices over to Buff Stadium. And so early in the season, after a game one night, I knew Gabe was out of town, And Gabe called and he says, "You got everybody there?" And I said, "No, the game was over early, Gabe. A couple of them have gone on." And he said, "Can you get them all back together?" Well, there was a small group. It was Grady Hatton, Phil Giles, who would come as PR director, and Dick McDowell, a fellow named Earl Johnson, who was, anyway, and Speck. And Speck was still there. I was still there. And I knew where the guys were going to get a beer or sandwich or something after the game. And I sent somebody else after him. They brought him back and Gabe said, "When you get the group together, call me back." And it turned out, I think he was in Jacksonville, Florida. We called him back and Gabe sprung the news on us that he was resigning and going to Cleveland as president of the Indians. Obviously, big shock. The club had been in operation. Our first payroll day was November 1, so then this was early April. So we've been going for 5 months, and here the leader was bolting or leaving. So that was a real shock. Gabe did ask us at that time. He said, I don't want to disrupt everything that's going on there. You all have opportunities. I ask that each of you give Hoffheinz and the club 60 days, before you make any decision. Well, that was fine. I was sorry to see Gabe leave, but I was still excited about Houston, expansion, opportunity, and so on. And I didn't give any thought to leaving. And as a few of the others did, Charlie Morris, who had been the ticket manager of Cincinnati and had been with Gabe for years. I remember Charlie, after that call, next day I went and saw Charlie's office and he had a big calendar up there, 60, 59, and started marking them off every day. And after 60 days, Charlie was gone. And but the rest of us hung on. And so, as I said, this was early April, a lot of concern about Gabe leaving. What's going to happen to the club? Are they still going to have a franchise? They're still going to go? And there were a lot of people who didn't understand expansion. There had not been any major league expansion since the American League since the American League announced that they were a major league in 2001. I mean 1901. So this was the first club change other than some location transfers, but there hadn't been any expansion. So it had all this speculation and concern. And so shortly after that, it wasn't too much, I don't know, a couple of weeks or so, I was advised that the Colt45 owners, Hoffheinz and the rest, or some of the rest, would be having a meeting over at Branch Street, and they asked me to stand by. In other words, to be over. I went over to Branch Street that day. And after a while, I was summoned downstairs into Hoffheinz's office. And there's Hoffheinz, Larry, Bob Smith, Cullinan, Kirksey, and the club's attorney, Red James, 5 of them. And I forget exactly how they introduced it, but swore me to secrecy and said, "We're going to bring in Paul Richards as general manager." Paul was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, the field manager of the Orioles at that time. He says, "But Paul's not going to come until the end of the season or close to the end of the season." So swore me to secrecy. And as I kept that pledge, there wasn't any need to tell anybody. Nobody needed to know and whatnot. Then a few days after that, Kirksey, who was sort of the go-between between Richards and the ownership group, George called me aside and said, Paul's going to be calling you, and he's going to use the name Blackie." So I go back over to Colt Stadium where we're officing and, we're putting together scouting staff and signing players and doing all this and that. And Ollie Sanders was a switchboard operator, and Ollie would ring back, say, "Tal, you got a call from somebody that identifies himself as Blackie." I just fine, put him through. I'm sure she thought it was my bookie. And so anyway, from that point on, I guess this is probably late April, early May. From that point on, I get calls, several times, sent from Blackie, and he's issuing sort of instructions. Go send a scout up to St. Paul, Minnesota. Sign Don Arlick. He's a left-handed pitcher. Give him $3,000. Another one I recall, Jimmy Marujo, a right-handed pitcher in Oklahoma with an Indian background. And one I offered him $20,000. And so I can recall it, asked Grady Hatton to do that. Grady went up and signed them, as if it was all set before he got there. Obviously, Paul is using or sharing information that he's got that stands at Baltimore. So he's got his sources, and we've still got a scouting staff, and so between the two of us, we're signing a lot of players and trying to get the Colt45s off on the right foot. Then in July of that year.
What year are you in now?
We're in 1961,
One.
the first year of the Houston franchise. So Gabe Paul is left. Paul Richards is going to be coming, but nobody knows it except me and Paul and Paul's family, I guess. But anyway, it ends in July. It says I get a call from Blackie, and as I said, he's managing the Orioles. Wanted me to come to Chicago. The Orioles have a split doubleheader, day night doubleheader with the White Sox on a Saturday, and wants me to come up. Suggested I stay at a different hotel. So I remember one of the hotels was the Blackstone. I forget what the other one was, and they were across the street from each other. And so I go knock on his door at 6:30 at a prearranged time, and Eddie Robinson, who I had never met before, Eddie Robinson answers the door, and so this is sort of how things evolved from that time on. Later on that summer, I heard or was advised, and I suspect it was probably Kirksey, that Paul wanted everybody's resignation before he came in. Well, in those, that's quite common or prevalent today. You get a new CEO or a new president, and they want their own advisors or their own department heads or their own cabinet members and so on. All you have to do is listen to the news and read the paper and see a lot of it today. And in those days, it wasn't quite that common. And fortunately, the ownership did not go along with that.
Hey,
Hi.
sorry we're late.
So now, good about seats.
Don't worry about
Okay. I'm telling the story about how I got to Houston and how I got involved with the Astrodome project. So now we're in 1961. I've met Paul, and as then comes September, he comes on board, and it's as you get when any change of administration, as I started to say, he wanted everybody to leave. They didn't. But over a period of time, some didn't feel comfortable, or some were sort of forced out, and so on. I can recall Bobby Bragan was a key member of our staff, and there wasn't room for Bobby with Paul and people he was bringing, so they made Bobby a coach. They got him out of the way by giving him a coaching position on the major league club. One of our most severe losses was Red Murph. We meaning prior to Richards, had added Red as a scout in this local area. He did a great job. Worked tirelessly and signed a lot of players. And while not always the easiest guy to get along with, and was quick to give you his opinion, which you want as a scout. But anyway, Paul didn't like Red, and I guess it was probably mutual. And Red left as soon as he could, and went on to great success with the Mets and signing Nolan Ryan and so on. But we started to lose some people as a result of the division. And as I said, Paul brought a lot of people with him, and some were very good. Very good baseball people. Lumen Harris, I thought was a good person, a good man, and there were others, but there were some that were added to the staff and sort of got in the way because they were primarily golfing buddies or some of them. Yeah, it was a motley crew. Some of them were real characters. I think were just all had around for laughs and nothing else, and it just didn't set well. And of course, I was much younger in those days, and I'm probably not as forgiving or as flexible. You think there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. So anyway, we get through the expansion draft at the end of 61, and we operate in 62, and we got a mixed staff. Some of the people that Bobby Bragan and Grady Hatton and Gabe and I had brought on, in the early years, and then the people that Paul had brought over from Baltimore and so on.
You're still in your twenties then, right?
Oh, yeah, in 1963 spring training, I'm 29. And had spring training for our minor league clubs in Moultrie, Georgia. That was Joe Morgan's first spring. I still remember that. I remember Joe playing ping pong out there in the lobby we had set up, and how competitive he was, and how how adept he was. And so, anyway, I thought it was a good spring. We had a number of interesting players and so on. By that time, most of the staff had been integrated by Paul and his disciples, as we term them. And so spring training concluded, and Johnny and Valerie and I are driving back to Houston. We're expecting Johnny's about 6 months pregnant, expecting her second child. And I get a call, I think it was Speck that tipped me off. He said, just want to give you a heads up, when you get back, there's going to be a termination letter for you from Paul Richardson. I'm not completely surprised. I was a little bit surprised we got it lasted as long as it did. He clearly didn't want us there. And so I get back, I had the termination letter. Paul's not there. It's just a hand, or not a handwritten, but a short type thing. And whatnot. And the word got out, and before I know it, his name Gabe Paul and Hoot Evers called me from Cleveland. Hoot Evers was a former center fielder for the Tigers, very good major league player. That time, director of player personnel for the Cleveland Indians with Gabe, and they both asked me to come up and join them and so on. And so anyway, that was a relief. Your ability to, we didn't have to worry too much about continuing your career. Here was another Harvard. And so that was fine. I took that call at home, and I think the next day I'm back at the Colts offices, and whatnot, negotiating my severance and signing out. I'm in the office with Speck that night, and the offices were small confines, and everybody had the door open. It was really, you could hear everybody's conversation on the phone or in person. And so the judge's office was just on the other side of this room, and he heard my voice, or knew I was there or something. He said, "Tal, I want to see you." So when I went over there, and I went in, and I talked to the judge on many occasions. I mean, as I said, small staff, number of meetings at which I'd be present, and whether it was financial or budget or baseball issues, or what that the judge would sit in on. So I'd have a lot of exposure to him. And then, so anyway, he says, I'm sorry about what has transpired. He says, I can't change that. I need Paul, but I don't want to lose you. And he said, I can't override this. And I said, I understand. And so he goes on to talk again about how great the dome is going to be and what it means and so on and so forth. And he said, I'd like for you to consider staying and serving as my assistant and taking over as a coordinator or liaison or whatever. And so I said, Judge, you need to look at my resume again. I said, I'm not an architect. He said, I know all that. He said, I've seen you for 2 years, and I know I know what you can do, or I think you can do it. So anyway, I went home, talked to Johnny about it. Called Gabe, talked to him about it, and Gabe was great. He said, I'm not a big fan of the judge. He said, but he is a brilliant man, and this sounds like a great opportunity, sort of a once in a lifetime. He said, I think you ought to give it a try. If it doesn't work out, you always got a home here. So that, it's all the support you need. As I said, we're expecting our second child. Don't particularly want to move. But the more I thought about it, this was unique. There's never been a covered air-conditioned stadium. I mean, it seems commonplace today. In those days, it wasn't. It was really a marvel, even though it wasn't built yet. It was starting. We had the hole in the ground. That was it. So anyway, after talking to Gabe and talking to Johnny, and I just talked to my parents and whatnot, I really didn't deliberate long. I just felt, okay, this is this is a new chapter. Whatnot, so we did that, and since at that time I had a flashback, and I'm digressing. I hope I'm not running too long, Joe.
Right.
No, it's sort of a flashback. to when I was 13 years old. It was the summer of 1947. And a friend of mine, at that time we lived outside of Philadelphia, just in Marion, Pennsylvania. And a friend of mine and his family invited me to spend a weekend with them at the beach at Atlantic City. At that time, Atlantic City was far different than it is today. There wasn't any gambling and so on. It was really a boardwalk and a lot of entertainment and a lot of entertainers. And I remember Sinatra was very prominent, prevalent in the his early stages of his career there, and so on. And they had a boardwalk with a lot of different carnival type things. And I happen to remember the date as being, well, I actually looked it up. I know the date was July 25 because that was significant from a baseball standpoint. As I said, I lived in Philadelphia, so obviously I followed the Phillies, followed the A's, went to a number of games at Shibe Park. When the rest of the time I was always had my ear glued to the radio when I could, listening to the broadcast. And I remember this Friday night after we got to Atlantic City, the Phillies were playing the Reds in Cincinnati. And I was interested because Yule Blackwell, the whip for the Reds, and just a month earlier, Blackwell had no-hit the Braves and then come back and for 8 1/3 innings, no-hit the Dodgers. He was within 2 outs of equaling Johnny Vandermeer's record of consecutive no-hitters. Stanky broke up that one. So anyway, he didn't get the second consecutive no-hitter, but on July 25, when the Phillies are going to play the Reds there, Blackwell is going for his 16th consecutive win and his 12th consecutive complete game. The 16th consecutive win would have been, at that time, a National League record for right-handed pitchers. And he said he went. So anyway, we had our ears glued to the radio and listened to that. Blackwell did win the game, got his 16th consecutive victory, his 12th consecutive shutout. I think at that time he was 17-3 or 8. That may have been 18-3. But anyway, that's how I happen to remember the event. But getting back to why we were in Atlantic City and the carnival and so on, just walking up and down the boardwalk, one of my friend and I, there was a fortune teller. And so we stopped and I don't know, just there and just to see what she had to say. And it didn't cost much money. I forget if she read poems or waved a wand or what she did, but she could tell our fortune. And my fortune, if you can believe it or not, at that time, she said, you're going to be an architect. Seriously. And I never get that a whole lot of thought. Lately, I was obviously interested in building ball clubs, not ballparks. But anyway, I had that flashback. I need to go back and see if she's still there and find out what she's got. She's got in money bags. So, but anyway, getting back to accepting the judge's offer to get involved with the Astrodome. As I said, this is April of 1963. The hole is dug, but not a whole lot else has happened yet. And before I know it, there's messengers and young architects coming over to our office at Colt Stadium and dropping all these plans in my office: structural plans, mechanical plans, electrical plans, architectural plans, specifications, a book like that. And so that wasn't going to work. My desk wasn't that big, so what we did, we got an office trailer and parked that next to the Colt45 offices, and that was great. So I had the privacy, but I had the room, and I needed that because over the next couple of years, it was just cluttered with samples. There were a lot of things in the contract and in the building plans that had not been finalized. For example, the seat selection. Who's going to provide the seats? There was a lot of competition, a lot of bidding for that, and a lot of meetings and presentations that I and architects and the judge sometimes and others would have to attend. The contract was finally awarded to American Seating. But my point is, in my office, I had all these samples of chairs and fabrics and colors and so on and so forth. So it stands, I didn't pay much attention to the structural plans or the mechanical plans. I felt if they needed me to sign off on that, the project's in deep trouble. So I put those aside. I don't think I barely, the one they need for me to look at. architectural plans are something else. We had a great team of professionals working on that. And engineers and the architects and designers were absolutely magnificent. Well, I don't think they got near the credit they understand they deserve. And one and I, since I got to know many of them, understand very well. And they had great vision, and of course, Hofheinz had provided so much of what he wanted in there. The only thing they didn't have any experience operating a ball club, understandably. So there's a lot of decisions that have to be made that affect the operation of a club. So anyway, I get involved with all the drawings and the documents and the specifications and so on. It's an awful lot of detail. There were three basic. I'm separating into three different areas. And the basic contract, and it's still amazing. The basic contract for the construction of the dome. Now, this isn't land acquisition or anything, just the construction of the dome. If I recall the numbers exactly, it was $19,476,000. $19 million. Can you imagine that? There are homes in River Oaks that cost more than that. $19 million. I think it was $476,000. We had a $500,000 contingency plan that we could use for whatever changes or upgrades needed to be made. $500,000 doesn't go very far today, and it didn't go very far back then. So anything that we needed to change, you had to sort of offset it if you could. When I started to say there were three basic divisions, there were some things that were not included in the contract documents at all, that the county was not paying for out of that $19 million. For example, the scoreboard, that was NIC, not in contract. There were other things like that, like the restaurants. Those of you that may have gone to the Astrodome Club on the 5th level, or obviously, well, I'll get into that later. Some other things that weren't on the contract that were the club's responsibility. And Hofheinz was a great salesman, great marketer, and he was able to trade off many of these things. You've heard the stories about trading off the AstroTurf, for use of the name and so on. Well, he did pretty much the same thing with other things like the scoreboard. Then there were areas where final decisions hadn't been made. I mentioned the seating contract, for example, and things like that. So there were a lot of decisions to be made. A lot of very involved, a lot of detail. So some of them you get solved by yourself, some of you did in conjunction with consultants or architects. Some the judge would have to play a hand in, like he ultimately did in AstroTurf, and so on. But you had a lot of small things when you come to think of what an immense building that is, and somebody has to determine which way is the door going to swing. Is it going to be a left-handed door, a right-handed door, or what they call a left-handed reverse that opens back that way, or right-handed reverse? You had to get involved in stands in keying. It's one thing to give a master key to somebody, but you don't want them to have every access to everything in the whole building. It's in the offices, the clubhouses, things like that. There was space allocated to that on the drawings, but it had to be reconfigured. So these are some of the kind of things that you had to deal with day in and day out. The two most notable things that I can recall, or the two that I enjoyed the most, I guess, was the scoreboard selection, the home run spectacular. And I made a number of trips to Des Moines, Iowa. Wayne has spoken about that and can continue to speak about it. That was just absolutely magnificent. I think that had as much to do with the impact and the recognition of the dome as any other feature. I mean, the fact that it was covered in air conditioning, yeah, but when you're looking for the flamboyancy, you find the colors stood out, but it was the scoreboard that got everybody's attention, and that was wonderful. So that was one thing. And the people in Des Moines Fair Play Scoreboard, Jack Foster was just an absolutely brilliant guy, great to work with. Olin Williams was the president of the company. So anyway, we worked with them and Federal Sign Company out of Chicago. Between the two of them, and they developed the scoreboard. We'd had a number of presentations prior to that, from scoreboard companies, and most of them were very nice. They took, took the most recent scoreboard and made some improvements to it. So that, I don't want that. I want something unique. This is the Astrodome. I don't want a plain ordinary scoreboard. So that's what led us back to Fair Play, and that worked out. And the other project, of course, was in AstroTurf, and that came after we opened, but that was a long involved thing. We opened, we had the glare problem, and I recall the judge came to me sort of with concern after it became obvious that we had to do something, and they painted the skylights, and so he says, Tal, you've got whatever you need, go find a solution. And easier said than done. And for months after that, I heard from people all over the world. I wish I had my trailer then. The trailer was gone. I had an office in the Astrodome and just packed to the gills with all kinds of samples and packages and stuff like that. So as I said, those were the two noteworthy things, but there was an awful lot of detail involved by an awful lot of people to make that building work. So I'll quit there, and maybe, I don't know if I've covered things of interest or not, but if you got time, Joe, I'll be happy to take any questions, whatever you want to do.
Sir, you got questions for Tal?
What was your title, when Judge Hoffines named you as assistant?
We didn't go much for titles at that time. I don't know that I ever had to use one. I think it was just assistant to the president or something like that. It was a lot different in those days. It was a lot better in many respects.
So once you got the AstroTurf in, your job was over?
That particular phase of it, actually, we, as many of you recall, in December, I think it was December of 1965, after the first year, the club always had a lot of surprises, whether it was Gabe leaving or Richards coming. This time the surprise was Hoffines fired Richards. And I think he just waited. He just had to get the Astrodome open before he could do that. I think he and Richards were on a collision course for a number of reasons. So anyway, he dismissed him. I want to say it was December, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And at that time, an ill-conceived solution, a triumvirate of Spec Richardson, Grady Hatton, and myself, which clearly didn't work. I don't think triumvirates ever work. And whatnot. But so that was in December. We didn't conclude the AstroTurf, so I was still involved with the AstroTurf thing into the following spring and stuff. So I'm sorry, Wayne, you had a question?
Tal, I think of all the time that you spent in construction and liaison for the judge with all the different people. How many days were you out there at 5 o'clock in the morning?
A few. It was more apt to be very late at night. I mean, when you say 5 o'clock, I hadn't left yet, you mean? It was more that than showing up early in the morning. It was late at night, and it was an amazing experience. I don't think I can ever do justice to it. But I wouldn't trade those years of that experience for anything. To know Hoffines and to work with them was just amazing. The group of professionals, the architects and engineers were just outstanding.
Why haven't you written a book?
Yeah.
Because I didn't keep notes, and I worry about publications where things aren't accurate. And I think there's too many books that are written. I read some of them myself, and I know for a fact I was there or I was present. I said, that's not right. That's not what happened. And then that becomes perpetuated. And I just vowed then I am never going to write anything unless I can document it. And when there's too much stuff I've been asked from people outside of Houston. And outside of SABR, I'm not talking about anything current. I've been asked about other books that have been published in the last 5, 10, 15 years. I've been asked to read or to edit to some degree things, and it just shocks me. Some of the things is that's not what happened. You got the name wrong. You got the so and so forth. So that's why I don't write a book.
Hey, Tal. On the Astrodome clubhouse for the players, how did that compare with other clubhouses of the time?
Oh, I guess you'd have to ask the players. I thought the players initially were overjoyed at everything in the dome. Except for the glare. You know, but I think everything else, I thought the clubhouse was fine. Obviously, today they're much grander, but it certainly beat Wrigley Field.
I remember three things that were unique, and I want to know if you had anything to do with them. Hoffine stretching the dugout because he knew people like to sit behind the dugout. He also stretched the urinals in the men's room because they were cheaper. And the color scheme was when the game was over, that place was so beautiful with the colors. Did you get involved in any of those three things?
Spent an incredible amount of time with the color scheme. And there were a lot of people, and anybody that came by or walked by, he'd bring them into the office. What do you think of this? And they'd have a certain array of colors. Or what do you think of this? And then you swap out one for the other. He got thousands of opinions on that before he made a final determination. But that was clearly his area. He was the final judge on that. As far as the dugouts, yeah, that was his idea. He said we can sell more seats behind the dugout. Even from a marketing standpoint, he was absolutely brilliant. He was way ahead of his time. I mean, the vision he had about the Astrodome. And there were a lot of skeptics. There were a lot of skeptics about expansion to begin with, but particularly you got to play in a covered stadium. That doesn't make any sense. As we were trying to put together staff. And there were a lot of people that were interested because they had the vision, could see the opportunity. There were other people saying, no, you haven't got any history. I don't, which is the truth.
It was converting it to football part of the original plan with the moving seats. Or did that?
Yes.
During your Astrodome period, I'm sure you were extremely busy, but given your focus of primarily being like a baseball guy, you must have been conflicted. I mean, how often did you think of calling Cleveland up and saying, get me back in?
No.
Never.
No. It was so all consuming. I think I sacrificed a lot of my relationships temporarily, and with the exception of one thing. Anybody that came into Houston, I probably took on a tour. We all had to do that. The lead architects would have to do it. The architects that were on the ground day in and day out, Bob Manshu, John Paku, Jim Muller, we all had to do that. And every visiting club that came in, I can recall taking managers and GMs and club presidents on tours. They all wanted to see it, and that's all part of it. So we did a lot of that.
Quick questions. What was your wage whenever you started out as an administrative assistant? And then the second question is, what was your proudest moment during the Astrodome time? Was it a specific practice or game or opening, just that moment that really sticks with you today?
Two thoughts come to mind. My first is Wayne said, about being there till 5 o'clock in the morning. On the evening of April 8th, 1965, I was there very, very late, into the morning of April 9. And I can recall with one of the architects, Jim Muller, who was a very dear friend of mine. And we were making the rounds and checking this and checking that. And the house lights were on, and we were standing out in center field under the gondola and just looking at it and just marvel. And it was absolutely beautiful. And that was without anybody in it. And it was completely different. You got people in it, it took on a different aura completely. So that I would have to say opening or the night before the opening is one that I really recall. And then I guess the next moment I recall couples with my baseball interest, and that would be the 1980 LCS.
On the dome itself, obviously it exceeded expectations. Are there any novelties that maybe in the planning phase that you guys discussed, but just decided, well,
maybe everyone's not ready for that, or are there any things that you guys had to omit because?
Oh, there was,
budgetary-
they sound insignificant, they're not, not very major, I can recall. You know, say memory has to go way back. If you were in ballparks, the older ballparks, before the dome, box seats were always designated with pipe railing. If you had box seat, you had pipe railing in front and down the side and behind you, a little opening to get in and out. And if we're working with the plans and whatnot, and trying to make the $500,000 work and trying to save, trying to take a door out here because we get credit for it or something like that. Since I thought all this railing, all it does is constrict. What do we need it for? And I don't even think we ran that by anybody. Jim Muller, the architect, Jim was involved in the seating configuration and so on. And two of us just decided to take it out. So we just eliminated pipe railing and saved several $1,000s we could use elsewhere. And didn't need it. Nobody ever raised a question. Today, you don't see pipe railing in ballparks, so there was no need for that. Turnstiles, I think we were the first stadium, and again, Jim Muller was involved with me in this. It said turnstiles can be restrictive if they're fixed. And we got concerned about not only the ingress, but the egress. And so, well, what do we need turnstiles here for? Why don't we just do portable turnstiles? And Jim says, well, let me see if I can find somebody that can do that. And he went to a turnstile manufacturer and asked them to put it on wheels instead of fixed. And so we started installing portable turnstiles. So we did things like that. Those are minor things, but they were different. I'm trying to.
Any crazy novelties that said, oh, we should do this, like, an aquarium in the ballpark or something out.
Or a bowling alley.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, bowling.
I can't think of anything like that. The dome was going to be so wonderful and so magnificent and so unique on its own. You didn't need swimming. I don't like swimming pools and ballparks. I don't like it belong. So is there wasn't any need for that? Oh, is there one area that I've sort of overlooked? When I talk about things not being on the contract, the entire 9th level, up there, all the skyboxes and the suites and so on. That was all independent of the basic contract. That was Hoffheinz and his private contractor, Red Dozier. And so we did that, and it's an awful lot of time. The judge would spend an incredible amount of time. We talked about colors. The same thing, selecting the dishes or the silverware to be used in each of the clubs, or the decor for each of the suites on the skyboxes on the 9th level. I can recall we had different models for each one. I didn't get a whole lot of involvement there other than to sort of coordinate what was going on, but so that was all Hoffheinz.
Hoffheinz had his office in the 9th level in right field.
Right.
And he set his chair in his top to one side. So they had to move the window so it would be square. And I used to see that up in right field. Was that part of the original construction? Was that?
I'm not aware of that, Mike.
No, it was there.
I'm sure you're not looking at it there.
No, I've got pictures of it, but is that there by the right field pole?
I don't recall. Wayne, you got any recollection of that? No, I think it's not.
That must have been a later thing. For those of y'all who don't know Wayne, he was the original scoreboard operator for the first 10 years.
He was more than that, and then became PR director for the club.
Oh,
And did a great job.
Talk about these stars coming that can give tours or people that would come and give tours. I remember many times Dad would come by and get Mom, and Doris Day, I'd like for you to meet my wife, because he was the one who really. I got to meet Fess Parker, and he came and got me for that, and Skipper from Gilligan's Island.
There was an awful lot of that because the dome, it's hard for people today to understand, particularly those that didn't experience it then, but the impact it had, and everybody that came to Houston wanted to see it. Most of the tours that I had to give were prior to the opening. And so I got people that had a occasion to be here for some other reason. We had a lot of foreign architects and engineers, and particularly from Japan. They seemed to inundate us, and they were always somebody here that something, the architects or somebody had to deal with. I got a lot of the baseball people. I got some of the politicians. The entertainers, for the most part, came after we were open. They weren't gonna get their shoes muddy coming up.
Tal, one of the innovations I think of is because it's indoors, you had air conditioning. I mean, Colt45 Stadium was impossible from what I heard, right?
Yeah.
And then
We didn't have any mosquitoes in the.
you got the reconfigurable stands, which allowed for sports like football
Right.
and basketball or other things.
Oh, the events that went in there, the Bobby Riggs, Billie Jean King thing, the boxing matches, the basketball, everything. It's and bullfights, everything. It was remarkable. It's always something different going on.
Tal, I have one question. Maybe you can talk a little bit about or you can just say real quickly, if there's one thing that's really disappointed you the most about what has happened to the dome in the last 20 years.
And the fact that it hasn't been refurbished and renovated and retained.
You feel like it's kind of like one of your babies just sitting there?
Yeah, I just think it's a lack of vision of people. I think that the dome was so significant and it meant so much. And if we're just going to erase history, fine, you get rid of
The Alamo.
the Alamo. There's a big story about the Eiffel Tower that I think Mike Acosta talked about that in his presentation in January. About the Eiffel Tower. Initially, they wanted to tear that down because they thought it was ugly, and now look at it. You know, so from that standpoint, I think it had such an impact on Houston. When I came through Houston on the way to Laredo in 1958, you know, Houston was certainly not the metropolis it is today. I mean, it was still Western, it was still cowboy and so on, and it's obviously changed, and the dome had a lot to do with that, I think.
Well, Tal, thank you very much.
So we need to do a head count on who doesn't have a dinner.
Too long.
No.
No, it was wonderful, Tal. Thank you. And y'all be sure to be here next year when Tal's gonna talk about Minute Maid Park.